Hello folks, I've done a lot of videos so far on guitars and ukuleles, so I thought I should probably talk a little bit about these things. Violins, fiddles, same thing. And you know, on occasion I fix up or set up violins and sell them locally, or set them up for local kids and things like that. And in the event that I do, I end up almost giving a lesson, if you like, on the properties of the instrument, because well, I get two types of customers. I often get parents coming with whatever the kid in question for the instrument, and they have absolutely no knowledge of what they're buying or what to look for, anything like that. So I spend time with them and go over things, whether they buy it or not, just so that they have the know-how for the next time they look. Or I get kids, sometimes younger players, who think they're informed and they'll rattle off all these things, and they're not really. So I thought I would do a quick video on what to look for when shopping for a student violin. And when I say student violin, I mean violin in under $500. I'd say anywhere from $100 to $300, $400, $450, even $500, $600 is going to be student quality. Then you get into your intermediate violins, rather like guitars, from the $500 to $1,000, $1,200, $1,500 range, even $2,500. And advanced violins, of course, go anywhere from a few thousand to millions. So bear that in mind when you're looking for a student violin. I get a lot of people who want to buy a violin, and it's sort of like the guitar people as well. They want to buy an instrument for $100, $150, $200, and they're expecting, you know, something in quality-wise that's comparable to a $2,000, $3,000 violin. That's not feasible at all. But you can get yourself a good instrument if you have a good eye. So let me go over a few things. This is what you'll find when you open most cases. They come, a lot of them come in outfits, not all of them, but a lot of them come in outfits like this. Usually you get an oblong or a shaped case with bow and violin. The case doesn't really matter. If you get a nice case, that's great, but you can buy cases fairly cheaply. And the same with the bow. The one that came with this is, it is a Brazil wood bow, but it has a rosewood frog, which is second best. You really want an ebony frog if you can. And then the most important thing about the bow is it does have horsehair. They make this synthetic hair that doesn't play right. It doesn't grab the strings properly, even with a lot of rosin on the hair. It's always better to have a horsehair bow. And believe it or not, it's better to have a good synthetic bow than a bad wood bow. It's a bit like the guitar world. It's better to have, you know, a good laminate instrument than a bad solid instrument. Wood is great if it's good quality and well made. If it's not, it's not really a benefit. This one here, if you can see, it's bending this way, and the bow hair is slack, so it does have some camber in the stick. Camber means this kind of curve. That's what you want. If it's the other way, like that, the bow is not going to play. It's fairly much ruined. And the reason why they lose their camber is when you're not playing it, you should slacken it off. Turn it counterclockwise 2 or 3 turns so that the strings are loose, like that. And then when you play it, of course, you crank it up. This is not a great bow, but it's not a deal breaker. You can get a decent bow, a fiberglass bow, what, $40, $45, $50 online. A wood bow, probably, I don't know, $75 to $125 for a Brazil wood bow. You can see there's hair hanging off this one. It does have camber, but it's not great. When I tighten it, the stick straightens very, very easily, and there's a big gap here. So it's not a great bow, but that's not a reason not to buy the outfit if the violin is good. So the case and the bow are rather ephemeral. So let's look at the violin now. Now, a lot of people get hung up on what the violin looks like. That's a big mistake. It's nice if the violin has flame, and this one has a bit of flame if you can see it. But the violin world is also rife with fake flame and photo flame. In fact, they've been doing it longer than the guitar makers have. So if you see flame, and this is a one-piece back, you can, if you have the tools, get a light and look in the F-hole and make sure that the figure on the inside of the back matches the figure on the outside. That's a bit finicky. Also, if it's laminate, you won't be able to tell. But by and large, the flame is an extra. If you get a nice flame violin, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to sound better than a plain maple violin. So that is sort of an aesthetic plus if you can get it. But a lot of flame isn't real, and a lot of instruments that are flamed aren't necessarily graduated properly. And what that means is the thickness of the wood in certain parts of the violin aren't correct, aren't to proper spec. Whether they're building it on the Stradivari pattern, which is the most popular, or one of the other common patterns. So the maple in the back, what I always do is I look through all over the back of the instrument and the sides, the ribs of the instrument, and what you don't want to see is any cracks actually in the body of the instrument. If you have a crack in the seam, like the seams coming apart in the back or the front, that's not really a big deal. A couple of clamps, a bit of hide glue, that's an easy repair, one of the easiest repairs in the violin world. Of course, if you're paying a few $100 for something, you don't want to have to go do a repair, so that's up to you. But it's not an indication that the violin is necessarily bad. Violins are designed when they're under pressure to come apart at the seams rather than in the body or the table of the instrument. It's cracks in the actual wood that are things to look out for and that you want to avoid, particularly when it comes to the top. Now the top will almost always be spruce, so it's a softer wood, and that's where you get all of your tone. The back, the maple in the back, or hardwood, is where you get your rigidity. That's how the instrument can stand all the pressure that the strings put on it. The top wood is where you get all your tone. You don't necessarily want to buy a violin with a crack in the top, unless you're a luthier or you know a luthier, and the instrument's worth it. If the instrument's vintage Italian or European, and it's still worth it to buy it with the crack in it and have it repaired. That's one thing, but most people buying a student violin are not going to want to deal with that, and most instruments in the student realm aren't really worth repairing because you have to take the top off, and it's a very expensive repair. So first of all, look for cracks. Also the joinery in the neck foot right here. Make sure the instrument is not pulling apart from the body, from the pressure of the strings. Or that the button, which is the piece that goes on the back of the neck foot, is not separated here, or there aren't any cracks in the neck foot or in the neck itself. That's a big repair. You want to avoid that. Next, you want to move up to the scroll, and you want to make sure that the scroll is clean and there aren't any cracks or fissures or anything pulling apart in the scroll. Scroll repairs are expensive. They're hard to do. Often they lead to breakages that ruin the violin. So you want to make sure that you have something that is clean, no evidence of anything coming apart or splitting. If you have a little bit of pulling away of the fingerboard, that's not quite as bad. Again, that's just a hide glue and clamp job. And if you know someone or can do the work, often you can pick up a violin really cheaply if it just needs a bit of gluing and clamping. And it might be worth it. You might get a bargain on it. But if you don't, most people who are buying a student violin aren't going to be able to do even those sorts of repairs. So the quality and the condition of the table and the actual body and the neck and the scroll is the most important thing. Now let's get to the fittings. One of the reasons why people get frustrated with beginner violins are these friction pegs. They're often cut poorly, fitted poorly. So make sure that the ends are flush with the peg holes here and that they're holding friction. A lot of times they slip. You don't want to get into a situation where you have to buy peg soap or peg dope to get it to move or to get it to stop moving. So pegs are probably the most important fitting, and ultimately you want a good hardwood peg. Best option, ebony. Second best option, rosewood, or a pearwood, or some other kind of boxwood maybe, or some other kind of good solid hardwood. Look to see if they're black. Same with the fingerboard. Look to see if there's evidence of paint. A lot of times cheap instrument makers will cut corners on fittings, and they'll use whatever hardwood they can find, and they'll paint them black to fool you that they are ebony when they are not. This is most commonly done with the pegs and the fingerboard. The fingerboard should always be ebony. Occasionally you'll find a rosewood fingerboard, which is okay, not quite as dense as ebony. Anything less than those two things is prone to warping, and they don't hold up. Now, a lot of people paint or ebonize their fingerboards, basically taking any old hardwood and painting it black so it looks like ebony. The way that you can tell that it's fake is if you get a mirror and a light, or you're able to position the violin to where you can look under the fingerboard, and you can find spots under there where they have missed painting or where you can see evidence of painting. Try to stay away from ebonized fingerboards. You don't know what you're getting. A lot of cheap eBay violins and cellos are made with ebonized. A lot of times they'll tell you, sometimes they won't. But that is the most important fitting. What's down here, of course, if you're buying an instrument and you don't know anything about setting them up, you don't want to pay to have them set up, you want a good bridge, a good tailpiece, and a good chin rest. But if those aren't quite desirable or missing, they're quite easy to acquire and put on. The most important of the three, obviously, is the bridge. Getting a bridge cut for a violin is going to be sort of expensive. If you're trying to get a violin around $120, $150, you don't want to go out and spend another $80 to have a bridge cut. You can't do this yourself. It's one of the most difficult things to do. Luthiers have to practice for many years on cutting those feet and shaping the bridge to match the contour of the violin or the fingerboard. So if it has a good bridge on it, the bridge should be maple. Make sure there's not gaps under the bridge feet. If there are, you're going to have to get that another bridge or get that one recut or refitted. Or any cracks or fissures or chipping in towards the top of the bridge, or in the inlets where the bridge is ornately carved. If you have a weakness there, it's going to fail. So make sure the bridge is clean, it's cut. You want certain dimensions with string heights, but if the bridge is good, you can always shave and refile the string slots if you know how to do it on a good bridge. Less important, of course, is the chin rest and the tailpiece. If you get a nice alloy tailpiece with the fine tuners built in, great. If not, you can always buy one. They're fairly cheap. Sometimes you get an ebony, a nice ebony or hardwood tailpiece, and you have the kind of fine tuners that can be fitted on there. If it's missing those fine tuners, you can pick those up $3 or $4 a piece. They're fairly cheap. Those can always be added. So the tailpiece is not actually as important as some people make it out to be. The chin rest certainly isn't either. Now this is a Guarneri style, I think, chin rest, and I think this is ebonized. It doesn't feel like ebony, it feels like paint. So this could be replaced. It's adequate for a student violin. A kid won't know the difference. And also if they're taking it to school every day and they beat the hell out of it, maybe you don't want top quality fittings on it. But this chin rest here, you can buy something else to replace it, and it's just got these two clamps here that hold it on. You get a little pin and you can put a new one on fairly easily, or have your teacher do it even. So the fittings are not as important as the actual table and the box, and also the fact that it has flamed wood or not is not really that important at the student level. You'll find a lot of these cheap violins have this thick gloss. That's just the way it is, factory finishes, same with guitars. I find they don't sound quite as good. The wood doesn't resonate quite as good with this thick gloss. I prefer a much thinner varnish, a hand-oiled varnish or a spirit varnish, rather than this nitrocellulite, this type of thick, brittle varnish. But it's not really that important at the student level. They build these so they can take a bit of abuse. If you have an instrument that's really fine wood and a thin sort of oil or spirit varnish, they chip and scratch a lot easier. Maybe you don't want to spend the extra money to have your kid scratch it up. So, at the student level, I would say stick with something comparable to this, and then if your child or if you continue to play and you get to a point where you want a better violin, then move up and find something with a much nicer finish. But at this level, it's not that important. One last thing, the neck at the back, I get a lot of questions on this. Why don't they finish that like the rest of the violin? Well, they're not supposed to. As with guitar players, they like the neck bare wood, so that you can move up and down, and your thumb or the part of your hand that's on the neck doesn't get stuck on it. I actually remove the varnish and sand this down if it's not done, whenever I'm setting them up. So this is not a defect in any way. You don't want this thick varnish, it's sticky. You don't want that where you're moving your hand up and down. So if you see that in a violin, that's the way it should be. So I think that's all of the major properties of the violin. If you just take some time, look one over. Of course you want to play it, but you can always replace strings, upgrade strings. A lot of these cheap violins come with probably the worst strings made, cheese cutters we call them. Often, $2-3 Chinese sets of strings. You can buy a set of super sensitive red labels for about $18-20, put those on any of these student violins, and immediately you'll improve the tone somewhat. You can spend more than that and get a set of Tomastic Dominants or D'Addario Helicors and improve it even more if you want to invest another $30-40 in strings. But the main part is the body of the violin. It's intact. There are no cracks. There's no cracking around the the scroll, and that the pegs are fit well. They don't slip, and that you have, if possible, look for ebony parts so that the parts don't warp because they're not adequate hardwood. So that being said, happy shopping, and now you know how to ascertain whether you have the prospect of a good student violin or not. See you next time.